All right. Welcome back. Welcome here. I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you for agreeing to join the Perinatal Podcast today.
Oh, I love talking about this stuff. It's, having the opportunity to sort of chat about, raising kids and about, substance use and all that. It's just, I love this conversation. So much fun.
Yeah. So let's take a step back a little bit. Tell me how you decided to get into education.
So that actually was not planned. I actually was in law school. I had it all figured out, as those of us, and in our 20s were positive. We've got it all figured out. I had it all figured out. I went to law school. I had a mentor. I knew what job I was going to do after I got out of law school, which was to work in juvenile court. And I even had sort of a job lined up. Like it was on. And then someone asked me to teach a summer course for gifted kids, the Duke Talent Identification Program.
Yeah, I've
And
heard of that.
they needed me to teach a class called Law in a Democratic Society. It was last minute. I had like no time to prepare. And I went and taught that day. I came home and my husband, true story, took one look at my face and like this glow. And he said, "Are you even going to finish law school? Because you are like glowing." And I did finish law school, but I never practiced, never took the bar. I went straight into teaching, and it
Wow.
it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
I can't tell you how many times I have people as guests on this show and they say something very similar, like, "Oh, I never wanted to be a therapist. Oh, I never wanted to get into writing. I never thought about, like, whatever it might
Yeah.
be." And it's just interesting how the universe walks us down these paths some way because someone randomly asked you to help with a Duke tip. That's
Yeah,
so
I mean,
cool.
I was 28 when I did that, and there were so many times along the way that I either had no idea what I was going to do with my life or thought I had it completely figured out. And if I had taken that path, I don't know, it might have worked, but I'm just so glad I had the space to. And this is something that actually parents bring up with me a lot. Like, should I let my kid quit piano or should I let my
Yes.
kid quit soccer? And my answer is always, childhood is supposed to be a time when you get to try lots of things. And, you know, if your kid loves soccer and wants to keep going with soccer, that's fantastic. But if your kid hates soccer,
Hmm.
then just sticking with it because it's what you've always done is the thing that's keeping your kid from trying some other thing that might be a thing that lights them up from the inside. So,
Yes.
yeah, I'm a big fan of letting kids try lots of things for this exact reason.
Okay, so this is not part of what we were going to talk about, but I'd love to go into this just a little bit further on your thoughts on
Of
this because
course.
my husband and I had the same conversation. We hold so much space for the what could be live your life, do you energy. We do also appreciate, like, when we grew up, like, you don't have to stay with it, but you do have to finish the season energy. Like, you
Okay.
find, like, what is the line? Let's talk about, like, what is the line between understanding that you made a commitment to something, but also freeing up that space? Like, do we finish the season? What do you, and everyone is very individualistic, of course, but like, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
I think it really depends on it really comes down to family priorities. So, for
Yeah, sure,
example, like I often use piano as the big example because
sure.
we I read something that said that if kids play piano, they're better at math. And so I'm like, woohoo. And the neighbor up the street was getting rid of their piano. And I'm like, great, we only have to roll it downhill. So we rolled it downhill and into my house. And we got it into my house. And my oldest kid was into it for like, I don't know, the honeymoon period,
Yes,
did some lessons.
yes,
And then we started fighting every single day about
yes.
practicing piano. Now, if I if our family was a musical family, if our
Mhm.
family prioritized that, I have a friend who does have a musical family, and their rule in their house is I don't care what instrument you play, but you will play an instrument. And the
Sure.
kids figure out pretty quickly that it's hard to switch between, to keep switching. But that's their rule.
Yes.
In our house, we have a couple of priorities, and that's you get outside and you get exercise every day.
Mhm.
We protect sleep, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
But whether or not you take a musical instrument doesn't happen to be one of our core family priorities. So
Sure.
I prioritize the relationship over the piano. And what was really funny about that is we found our the schmo down the road, our neighbor down the road, who of course it had to go downhill. So took the piano out of our house. I said, stick with it for 2 more weeks and then we'll reevaluate. And then if you really want to quit, then you're allowed to quit. So of course, he ended up quitting. We moved the piano downhill to another neighbor's house, and it became their problem. But what was really funny about that is my son did quit. And then about a year later, he picked up guitar because we happened to have a guitar in the house because my husband plays a little bit, and he fell in love with it. And after he really worked hard, and we figured out one of the key things I needed to learn about my kids is that they don't like lessons. But lessons don't have to look like the kind of lessons we envision with the piano teacher.
Yes.
I got this subscription to this thing called Jam Play, where you can pick your instructor. You can pick the style of music you want to learn. It could be jazz, it could be folk, it could be whatever. You can repeat lessons, you can skip lessons. And he was so into it. And then after he got into guitar and sort of really got on his way with guitar, he sort of abashedly came to me and he was like, if someone were selling a used keyboard, then, I might be interested. I now have 2 extremely musical kids. Mm-hmm. Ben, my oldest, still plays piano, and my daughter is studying music in college.
Wow.
Music and sort of political philosophy, but she worked with a composer this summer under an internship for composing for video and film. And yeah, I don't know if that would have happened under the other scenario, but all I know is once it was under their steam and it wasn't me imposing it on them, it took off for them. And that's not going to work in all families. And as I said, it comes down to priorities. I absolutely understand you have to stick out the season because there is a team that relies on you. Mm-hmm. I totally understand that. And I would never criticize someone for taking that stance. I also understand, my kid really wants to try welding, which, true story, was one of the things my kid tried. And, a new class is opening and it gets in the way of the team thing. So we're going to drop the team thing and he gets to try the welding or whatever. So it really depends on your family's priorities.
And what I'm hearing, thank you for sharing that story. I'm chuckling, picturing this piano just being rolled down the hill step by step.
It was great.
But what I'm hearing, though, is an intentional discussion of within the family system. What is the priority? Mm-hmm. What does that look like? Having the flexibility and not feeling so rigid of this is the rule. For example, you'll finish the season because we're going to do welding. But we've had this conversation of, okay, I understand you're not interested in the piano or soccer or whatever it is. So it all comes down to those intentional conversations.
Yeah. The 2 other ways to think about it is my friend KJ, who wrote a book called How to Be a Happier Parent. Ooh, okay. She did the smartest thing. She did the smartest thing with one of her kids. He is a joiner. He loves sports, loves team sports. He would do every team sport that he could. And when he wanted to add on another sport, he wanted to add on baseball. And she sat down with him and they looked at their calendar and she said, okay, let's make a list of the things that are really important to you that you have time for. Mm-hmm. And some of them were things like hanging out with my friends and playing blah, blah, blah. And she's like, okay, here's the number of hours there are in the day. And if you were to do baseball, you would not have time for some of those things. So which things are you willing to keep and that's so important for kids to start thinking long-term, to start thinking in terms of, goals and priorities and being able to gauge how many hours there are in a day and what fits into what. It's all really important evolution for the kids. And I love that she was so thoughtful about going into it. And then the other thing I hear a lot from parents is, well, I can't let her quit because she's been doing this sport since she was 6 and we have so much invested in it. Sure. And I'm sorry, but number one, chances are your kid's not going to play the sport in college because that's just how the numbers work.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and one of my favorite New York Times articles ever was, your kid's not going to play the sport in college. Now what? The idea is like, invested meaning what? Like, what are you expecting this to pay off as? Sure. And, so that comes up a lot too.
I hold the space for like, we put so much money and time and effort into it. And also, so you have this sunk cost. At what point are you willing to walk
do away? A little bit of do some behavioral economics with parents.
So at what point are you willing to be like, are we literally waiting until no college scholarships roll in and this person is allowed to quit? What does that look like? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking that jaunt off on a tangent with me, but I love that discussion. And as I mentioned to you before we started recording, like sometimes I'm having these conversations with people and I'm like, I have a 2 and a 4-year-old. So I'm like, my husband and I are already having these conversations. What does that look like? So yeah, absolutely.
But that's so important because, one of the things that being on the same page is so important. And in terms of like, there's so many conversations. We were just having this conversation with my older kid who's now 24, almost 25, and conversations you should be having with people that you're in relationships with, like from the get-go. Like, what happens if you guys have been dating for like a year and you find out that one wants kids and one doesn't? But being on the same page is so important. And so even with once you have kids, like, how are we gonna feel if like our kids have no interest in sports and want to do music? Or what are we gonna, those sort of starting at 2 and 4, I think, it makes things a little easier when you get down the line.
It's
because they're often hypothetical conversations are easier to have than like, oh no, we're in the moment and we have to actually figure this out.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely love it. So tell me a little bit more. So you're writing for how do you get, you're writing for an Amazon show. You've got an SAT question. How do we get from law school to teacher to?
Yeah. So I'd always written. I mean, writing was in the background of everything I've ever done. I didn't start professionally writing. Like, I had a couple of small published things, but I wrote a book that never got published. I mean, most authors you're going to talk to are going to be like, oh my gosh, thank goodness that first book did not get published, because that was my learning how to write a book. I actually had 2 of those. I had 2 books and one of them did get published, but they're both the process of learning how to write. So that first book didn't get published. And I managed to sell off some chapters as articles and things like that. And I said to my husband, I said, I just don't know what to write about now. Like, I'm out of topics. And he said, well, what really continues to light you up is teaching. So why aren't you writing about that? And I said, no one wants to read. Like, who is going to read about teaching? Well, as it turns out, lots and lots of teachers blog because it is a great way to share with other teachers what's working and what's not working in your classroom. So that's how it started out. I was literally just using a blog about what was happening in my classroom as a way of putting, myself out there and continuing to write and all that sort of stuff. And then eventually people started reading it. It got bigger and bigger. I got written about in the New York Times for that blog. And then people started sort of picking it up, and people started asking me to write for them. And then I wrote this piece about a study that came out of Australia about the effects of overparenting on children's mental health. And it was the first time I sort of thought, oh, this is bigger than just a blog post. I should try to pitch this some places. And so I pitched it to The Atlantic and they took it, which for me was an amazing full circle moment, because I applied for an unpaid internship at The Atlantic when I first got out of college and didn't even get an interview. And then my first article that I wrote for them became one of their most popular articles of the year and led to my first book. So it was a nice moment for me. So that's how the writing thing got started. And the SAT question was an article I wrote for the New York Times that the SAT people purchased in, and I did not know that it happened. This is how it often goes.
Oh, wow.
All of a sudden one day on Twitter, I have a column in TweetDeck just on my name to see, what's happening out there. And all of a sudden, all these weird semi-hostile messages started coming at me with weird pictures. And I said, what's going on? And then my friend KJ, actually, her son Sam, had just taken the SAT. And he said, Mom, Jess was on the SAT. And then we put it all together. And my son said, you're an SAT meme, because apparently that's a thing. Like on Twitter after the SAT, there are memes about some of the questions. And I was one of the essay questions. I was one of the reading comprehension questions.
Oh my, and I love how you said semi-hostile. That was
They were like, it was really funny. I still have the tweets because they were very, very funny. And what people don't tell you is they make your article a little less easy to understand because they want the kids to have to think harder. Yes. So it makes you look like a less clear writer. So some of the kids were a little miffed with me for not being clear in my writing. But when I actually read the question, I realized, oh, wow, they really took material out to make it less clear what I was trying to get at, so that they could
Yes.
do the reading comprehension questions.
Right. Well, and that's the purpose of the exam versus enjoying. I'm actually, if I may, I'm actually a subscriber to The Atlantic and I love it. So much different between my 38-year-old self just reading to understand what's going on versus being tested on your ability to interpret and extrapolate from there.
Well, and to your other question, the Stinky and Dirty Show was really interesting. I was approached, someone recommended me for the Amazon sort of thought leader board, which is essentially this group of experts that comes in and helps Amazon make children's programming. And I was asked to be a part of this. And I was like, well, first of all, I don't really want to be a part of part of something that increases screen time for kids. That's just not interesting to me. I'm always interested in trying new things and learning how to write scripts and stuff like that. That's interesting to me. But being a part of creating screen time for kids isn't that interesting to me. But then the person who approached me about it, I got a better idea of who she was. And she's the creator of Blue's Clues, Alice Wilder. And you don't say no to Alice Wilder. And I had the most amazing experience. So I wrote the curriculum for the Stinky and Dirty Show. I would review scripts and make sure that what they were doing in the script adheres to the research on learning and resilience and cooperation and innovation and stuff like that. And it was just, I'm so grateful for that experience. I'm really, really grateful I got to be a part of that show.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that sounds so wonderful. And again, that's the thing, right? We're all trying to navigate what it looks like, screens versus not, but there's education to be had, and it's very individualized to each person's household, but that's really great to know that there are programs out there where you can see something that's based on evidence and learning and making sure it's really intentional. It's not just flashy colors and something for distraction, but for also.
Yeah, they've done a really, I'm not last person to shill for Amazon, but they have done a really great job, like Pete the Cat and all of these really great shows actually come, what they do is they say, okay, I really like, for example, this book, like for Stinky and Dirty and Pete the Cat were both based on books, but then they bring in the experts on the science behind the learning or the science behind the psychology or whatever. And like my friend Scott Barry Kaufman was the person who came in on Pete the Cat and was their expert for that show. And I just really appreciated the deference they gave to making sure that everything was based on the evidence and that they weren't just entertaining, that they were teaching. And that was a new experience for me. I was really happy about that.
Wonderful. Yes, my son has a Pete the Cat doll and he loves the Pizza Party book. And we haven't seen the show, but we have a couple of the books and that's really lovely. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk, well, not even pivot, we've already mentioned it a little bit. And you talked about the Australian study and resilience and all of that, about the gifts of failure that you wrote. How do we walk back from this like achievement, forcing our children to be perfection, get that college scholarship, be number one? How do we acknowledge failure as a gift?
Yeah, I mean, it's what's so interesting is I was interested in two questions as a teacher, as a middle school teacher at the time, and as the parent of two kids.
Yes.
So I was super critical of the parents of my students. I was at this very high achieving school and the parents were really intense and there was a lot of parenting going on. So I was pissed off at them. And then, of course, I had this sort of moment where I realized that I was doing the same thing to my own kids. I just wasn't recognizing it in myself. And so at that point, I have the coolest job in the world, which is to get curious about things, go into my hidey hole office, research and read everything on the planet that I can find about that topic. And then distill that, create, communicate the science to people who don't necessarily want to go into their hidey hole and read studies for 2 years. And I love that job. I love that job. So my question became, what is overparenting doing to motivation? And what is it doing to kids' ability to learn? And sort of psychologically, what is it doing to them as human beings? And it turns out that the things we use, there's sort of two different ideas here. The things that we use to try to get kids to learn, to do what we want them to do, to behave, to, be the people we want them to be, is extrinsic motivators, grades, points, scores, trophies, the threat of punishment, our love, Do we give our kids more love when they, bring home the grades we want, as opposed to the grades that we prefer they wouldn't be bringing home? All of that stuff, that's all extrinsic motivation, attempts to control kids' behaviors using carrots and sticks, whether they're positive or negative. And that actually undermines kids' motivation, undermines all of our motivation. And this is really well-established science. We have over 50 years of studies and meta studies that show that when you use extrinsic motivators to try to get people to do things over the long term, especially things that require planning or goals or creativity, that we actually undermine the chances. We undermine motivation, we undermine creativity, and that runs counter to education, because at its very best, education is a long-term creative endeavor, right? And so I'm toast as a parent, because I use extrinsic motivators all the time, whether it's taking away a stuffed animal or a sticker chart, or you're grounded if you don't or reading kids' emails, or getting on the portal for the school and checking their grades. All of those are extrinsic attempts to control from outside. And then as a teacher, I'm giving grades, I'm giving points, I'm giving scores. You should see how high we can get kids to jump for like an extra credit point, no matter how irrelevant or tiny that extra credit point is.
Yes.
But
I have
that
specific examples from high school that just came flooding to mind when you said that. Yes.
But then not only does that undermine long-term motivation, I say it really bluntly in the book, if you want kids to not want to learn math, pay them for their math grades. It's really, really clear. And the science is really, it's solid. On top of that, the things we do when we overparent kids, whether it's being highly directive, telling them exactly what to do in exactly what order, and clearing away any stumbling blocks, all of that sort of stuff, actually makes it less likely that your kids are going to be able to stick with challenging, like whether it's the extra credit questions and on the math quiz, or whether it's something that just scares them a little bit or is just at the edge of their ability level. Kids who have had highly directive parents, meaning like parents who just tell them exactly how to do and in what order to do it, and what with what color ink, or step in and do it for them, those kids are a lot less likely to complete challenging tasks. And those challenging tasks, unfortunately, in one sense, are these things called desirable difficulties. And it's one of the most powerful teaching tools I have as a teacher, because when we give kids desirable difficulties, tasks that are just at the right level of difficulty, we actually can create deeper learning in the short term and more durable learning in the long term. So if you think about, okay, well, if kids who are overparented or more directed are less likely to be able to complete things that are a little bit difficult, then those kids are going to be less likely to learn from desirable difficulties. It's a whole puzzle that when it comes together, you say, oh, this is not just damaging to their motivation, it's damaging to the potential for their learning. And, there's a lot of other layers to it, but that's at its base, what we got going on. And then, the basic idea is we need to foster intrinsic motivation as much as possible. And the way we do that is with three things. It's with giving kids more autonomy, which is control over their world and their tasks and their lives. Helping them feel more competent, which means not confident, that's optimism, and that's fine and good, but competent, like actual skills.
Yes.
And building your connection with your kid, a real connection that's based on like trust and support, and I love you, not some imaginary version of you that I wish I was raising, but you. And I don't just love you based on the fact that you brought me this A, I love you no matter what. And all those three things are going to make it a lot more likely that your kid will be invested in learning and growing and being and practicing piano or doing whatever it is we're trying to get them to do for the sake of the thing itself.
Yes. Yes. We talk about that a lot in mental health, the external versus internal motivation, especially in recovery, certainly. And that the carrot and stick can certainly get a person to so far and to some point. But not driven from the inside. Where do we go? And
there's a lot of controversy about that actually in the recovery world, because there are a lot of recovery programs that will use, whether it's incentive programs like, money incentives, stuff like that. And then there are people that come and say, well, but my kid is different. But the research that's been done on extrinsic motivators and the damage it does to motivation and creativity are not like this isn't like one type of kid versus another type of kid, or adults versus kids. It's a human thing. So yeah, it's the research is it's really solid stuff.
It is. Yes. And that's been another conversation that we've been having too. I've seen a lot recently about people recognizing not to praise the work, but the effort. Wow, you
Yeah.
hard on that. Well, I was gonna say, I was curious about your thoughts.
Yeah. That gets oversimplified a lot. And what you're talking about, is work that came out of Carol Dweck's work and her book Mindset. So it is true. Carol Dweck wrote this brilliant book, Mindset. If you want to read the geeky version that includes the studies, it's Carol Dweck's Self Theories. It's really good too. But Mindset is a really important book to read, and it's important that you read the book and not just like articles about the book, because it has a lot of nuance to it that gets lost. And
Yes.
even Carol Dweck has had to come out and say, that's not what I meant. Because if you think of it the way a lot of people think about it, it's that you never tell kids they're smart and only praise them for their effort, which is stupid. That's not what she meant. And that doesn't work. What we need to be doing though, is thinking less about like helping kids understand that intelligence is not, we're not born with a certain IQ. We're not born with a certain intellectual horsepower. It is something that is malleable. And the more we try things that create new connections in the brain, the more we do things that are outside our comfort level, a comfort zone, the more we try things that scare us a little or push our limits, the more we build our capacity to become more intelligent. And kids who understand that have what's called a growth mindset. They understand that the more they take the challenge problems, the more they admit what they do and don't know and ask for help, the more they try things that are a little bit challenging for them, the more capacity they're building for intelligence. Whereas kids who think they're, those poor kids who are told like, you've just always been so good at math, it comes so naturally to you, math is so easy for you. A friend of mine who's a math professor, actually at Cornell, Steve Strogatz, who writes so beautifully about math, he talks about the fact that, that does such a disservice because math gets hard for everybody. Math, if that wasn't true, if math was just easy for some people, there would be no unsolved theorems and proofs that have not been proven,
Yes,
so when it does get hard, how the kid reacts to suddenly not being able to do something or understand something, that's what's going to make the difference between a kid who quits and says, oh, this just isn't for me. Like when I got my first really low grade, my first really, really low grade was in my first year of law school. And my immediate reaction to getting that grade, a grade I had never seen before in my life. I didn't even know if it was a D or an F because I didn't know where the cutoff was because I'd never gotten that grade before.
Yeah.
My immediate reaction was to tell my best friend that I had to quit law school and I needed to do it quickly because A, it's clearly just not for me because I can't do this. And B, if I do it quickly, no one will find out and it won't mar that smart label that I'm so proud of that I have stamped to my forehead. That's always been a part of my identity.
Yes.
And my best friend, thank goodness, was able to say, or let's hit pause for a second. We could go talk to the professor and find out what went wrong so that you can change what you're doing and do better next time. I mean, thank goodness for her. In fact, there's a picture of her right behind me on the wall.
Oh.
Thank goodness for her because I did that.
Yes.
I found out what I had done wrong was this dumb thing that I hadn't even thought of. And I did great the next time because I learned from my mistakes. That's what I don't want for kids. I do not want kids to come up against something difficult and say, well, forget it. I'm like the worst. I'm just not a math person.
Yes.
That's BS.
Yes.
That is BS. And in fact, when I read Carol Dweck's Mindset, yes, math is harder for some people. Like, for example, I have a kid who is an economist. He studied math, he double majored in math and economics, and he loves math. And it's one of those things that just clicks for him. In 7th grade, I was told that I just, in so many words, just wasn't a math person. And I believed that. And I adopted that as part of my identity, avoided math until I didn't have to take it anymore. And and then when I read Carol Dweck's Mindset, when I was like 30, I was in my 40s. I was like 43.
Mhm.
I read mindset. I got so angry at that seventh grade teacher
Yes.
and
Yes.
at myself for letting that become my identity. So I
Mm.
went back and took algebra 1 with my kid and my own students with
Yes.
the math teacher at the middle school where I taught, and I loved it.
Amazing.
I loved it. I had so much fun. It
Yes.
wasn't that I'm not a math person, it's that math is challenging. And for me, it's difficult to visualize, but by putting myself through that and trying again and learning from my mistakes, I learned a little bit more how to visualize math, and that was great.
Yes. That is so true. I have so many anecdotes of people in that same conversation of I was told I was bad at this. And so
Yeah.
I basically I wrapped myself in that label and I moved forward in life being bad at math or singing or whatever it might be. And that is so dangerous, especially when you're what, in seventh grade, 12?
Yeah. Yeah.
And an adult who, I mean, when you're 12, adults know everything, right? They're your teacher, told you I'm good at math and you are bad at math, and I
Yeah.
know, therefore go on your way.
And it is an extra, I tell the story sometimes when I'm out doing speaking stuff. It's a vivid moment for me. I remember exactly how I felt in the moment when I learned
Yes.
that I wasn't a math person, blah, blah, blah. And it is true. I love strengths-based parenting and strengths-based teaching. I think operating from your strengths is great. I operate from my strengths. Writing is something that lights me up. It's something that I love. It's something that I am talented at, but it's also something I've had to work really hard at. Like when I joked about having to write 2 books to learn how to write a book, it's absolutely true. The first version of The Gift of Failure was so bad that my editor at Harper was like, I think you need some help. We may have to bring someone in to help you write. I'm like, you can't, I'm a writer. You can't bring in another writer to help me write a book. And so
Yeah.
I had her tell me all the mistakes I made, how to do it differently, what to do. Like, I had to learn how to write a book. Why? I thought I could just write a book without any instruction on how to write a book. But my other option was to shut down and say, fine, let someone else come in and do it over for me. And I'll just slink away and hope no one notices. But it was important enough to me to write this book that I said, no, give me some probationary chapters. Let me try to do it myself. You tell me everything I did wrong. I will learn from it and I will not repeat my mistakes. And the coolest thing for me, sorry to run on with this story, but the coolest thing
Please,
for me
please.
is if you were to ask my children what I'm most proud of in my entire adult career, they will not mention the New York Times bestseller list. They will not mention, sales figures. They will mention the moment that I found out that my book, The Addiction Inoculation, in its rough draft form, was so clean that we could move up the production schedule and it could come out earlier than we anticipated because I had learned. I basically made a checklist for myself of everything to do, everything not to do, made sure I did not repeat my mistakes and I learned from them. And when my editor came back to me and said, I don't know what happened, but between book 1 and book 2, you learned how to write a book. And this book is so clean. I hardly ever see books this clean. That right there was my proudest moment as a writer.
I
I
have
messed it up
actual
the
chills.
first time. It was the best.
Yeah.
In fact, I saved the note she wrote me that day because I have some like awards and things in here, but this note that she sent me about that means way more to me than any of that other stuff.
Yes. Learning, changing, growing, evolving, and putting that into practice. I literally, I mean, I'm wearing a sweater, so you can't tell. I had chills. Story. It's fantastic.
It
Well,
was good.
so let's pivot. Let's go on into the new book.
Yeah.
Where did the origin, how did that come to be? Where was the thought of like, this needs to be discussed?
So when I first got the book contract for The Gift of Failure, I was really in trouble. I'm an alcoholic and I was so sick and I was right at the place where either I was going to lose everything or I was going to get a grip and stop drinking. And luckily I had someone, my dad, come to me just at the right time and say, this is the moment that you have to make a decision. You are an alcoholic. You are going to mess up the biggest opportunity you've ever had, let alone your marriage, your job, blah, blah, all that other stuff. You need help. luckily I was also, at the place mentally where I also knew I needed help. Like I was exhausted and I was sick and it was awful. So luckily those two things came together at the right moment. That hardly ever happens. It's hard. I talk about getting to that place as being like a 100-piece puzzle. And yes, my dad was piece 100, but he couldn't have been piece 100 if pieces 1 through 99 hadn't already clicked into place. So I was ready.
Right.
So I got sober on June 7th, 2013. And right after that, after I had about a year of sobriety, I started teaching in a rehab for adolescents because I wasn't teaching full-time anymore, but I still really needed to teach. So I was teaching part-time. And I just started thinking about like, okay, I'm one of a long line of alcoholics, and my husband comes from a family that has a long line of addiction in it as well. Substance use disorder, the term we're actually supposed to use.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that are my kids doomed? Like, I didn't know what the science said on that. Like, what role does genetics play? All that other stuff. And at the same time, I'm teaching kids who, for whatever reason, ended up in this rehab. And how did they end up here? Like, what could we have done differently as parents and in education? What can education do differently? And so, again, I think the best work I do comes out of a very genuine need to know answers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got to go into this. And I spent a year, like the proposal for this book took me a year to write because I had to learn so much about, the origins and just all that stuff. And so what I was able to do was sort of look at what I wrote, hopefully, is sort of a best practices in terms of where we are right now with the research on what risk factors are, how we understand them, and how we use protective factors and protections for our kids as strategically as possible in order to lower the chances that they will end up with substance use disorder during their lifetime. And prevention works. Like when it's evidence-based prevention, we know it works. Right now, we're in a period where we are at some of the lowest numbers we've ever seen with kids under the age of 18 using drugs and alcohol. And that's fantastic. We're headed in the right direction. And the better and more evidence-based our interventions get, the lower those numbers can go. So we have a lot of distance still to go, but we're headed in the right direction. And I just actually, it's funny because I actually did just get an award I'm super proud of for this book. The Research Society on Alcohol, which is the scientists that do the research, like I went to their conference recently and I was hanging on by a thread. These were like geneticists doing like the really deep, it was crazy. But they gave me an award for the best translation of the science into something intended for popular culture. It was called their Media Award. And
wow.
Publishing awards are great. Like obviously getting the Pulitzer, getting the Nobel, that's fantastic.
Yes.
But having the scientists tell me that I got the science right, oh my gosh, I was like, that to me is, oh my gosh, the best thing that ever could have happened.
And congratulations on that. That is huge.
Thank you.
I talk about that even, I teach at the University of Kansas, and I had my students do a research synthesis over the summer. And I talked about the difference between, this is a master's level class and you're using other people's research and you're trying to distill the information and re-present it to me in a way that is meaningful. And it was I brought in our writing, we have a writing coordinator who works, and people were really stressed about it. And these are people in the master's program. And so, and certainly it's very important to be able to have somebody to translate that for the rest of
and it's the reason I'm such a fan of, and people get so mad at me about this, I don't think that high schools should be teaching pre-calculus and calculus. I think they should be teaching statistics. I think the more we teach kids about ideas like confirmation bias and sample size and p-values, so they have an extremely rudimentary level of let's question this. Why someone's telling me a recent study said blah, 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 blah. And that's well and good. But I would, it would be really great if we had like a working knowledge of, and who knew I was going to go back and learn statistics in my, 40s, but here we are.
Here we are. You're so true. And that's another conversation, right? I'm in a room full of social workers. I'm in a room full of people who have either been told or somehow interpreted that they are not good at math. We had this conversation. Anytime I talk about something from the research, we make that joke, and I'll even ask, like, okay, did any of you all have to get have it, like when I got into grad school, we had to have had a statistics class in order to be able to get into the MSW program,
Right.
because we had to take 2 research classes and have to be able to understand that. And just going back to the conversation we were having earlier, to recall that, like, it's a room full of people who are like, oh, you want me to like understand what these numbers mean? And it's like,
Yeah.
you
My
can.
daughter my daughter was so lucky. The public high school that she goes to offers statistics, and it was
Yes.
really important to everyone, and including her. I think she has, she has a brother that's really deep into the math, and he was able to help her when she got stuck in her stats class. But having statistics just gives her a leg up on and being a critical thinker,
Yes.
and being able to interpret, because studies can say anything. And, I think we need more critical thinking out there, and stats is a really good place to start with that.
Yes. Well, that's a whole other podcast topic to talk about,
Yeah.
whether or not people understand what research really is.
Yeah.
And how to interpret it, and where it comes from. But
Yeah.
so, but no, I really appreciate that. And I love to hear what does it look like to start laying that groundwork for substance use abuse prevention?
Mhm.
Talk about even in children as young as preschool.
Well, it turns out that substance use prevention is we're not really supposed to say substance abuse, it's substance use
Yes.
disorder, but substance use disorder prevention, because the big picture here is delay for a couple of reasons. First of all, not delay with the education, because education, the best possible prevention that we know of, starts really young, pre-K and K. I talk about that. I give scripts in the book, all that kind of stuff. And it starts with like bodily autonomy, things that should stay on the outside of our body, and not, why
Yes.
we don't swallow the toothpaste, but we put it in our mouth, but we don't swallow it, and why we never take a medication that is prescribed for someone else. All those why we don't eat Tide Pods, all of those kind of conversations. That's the genesis of conversations later about misuse of prescription pills, or why some pills do look like Skittles, but here's why: every time you find something like that on the floor, you need to come and ask mommy or daddy or whomever if that's something you're allowed to put in your, those kind of conversations sort of organically come out of that. So substance use prevention starts really young. It needs to be based on real information, and which is why in the book I provide lots of sort of information for parents to base their knowledge based on, so that they have accurate information for kids, and dispelling a lot of we as humans do some faulty thinking about how much other people drink, for example, or how interested other people are in having, for example, alcohol around. It's this thing called pluralistic ignorance. And the more we dispel that, the better. And so one example of what I'm talking about is, so the younger a kid is when they have their first drink or drug, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. And for the statisticians in the crowd, yes, there are flaws with that, because you can assume that like kids who are exposed to alcohol in their homes younger probably come from people who might also have an issue with that, all that sort of stuff. But the younger a kid is, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. Also, kids' brains are not adult brains. The human brain is not done developing until the early to mid 20s. And so things that can have a mild to moderate risk in an adult brain, for example, like cannabis, can have a moderate to high risk in an adolescent brain. The adolescent brain is going through the second of 2 periods of unbelievable growth, development, restructuring. There are all these technical words like pruning and all that sort of stuff. But those chemicals and the disruption of the neurotransmitters in our brain and the hormones and all that other stuff messes with brain development. And so the longer a kid can go and have their brain protected from outside influences, environmental factors, and the longer they go, out towards 18 or 21, the less likely they're, lifelong risk. So let's say you have an 8th grader and someone offers them a beer and they're like, oh, no big deal. No, thanks. I don't really want one. And the other kid is like, oh, come on. It's no big deal. Everybody does it. First of all, if your 8th grader knows that everybody does it just isn't true, that only 24.7% of 8th graders admit that they've had more than a sip of alcohol by the end of 8th grade, and that number continues to fall, that right there sort of gives them that, hold on, that's not right. I know differently.
Yes.
And that if your kid in 8th grade has that drink, their risk of developing substance use disorder over their lifetime hovers around 50%. But if they can make it to 10th grade without their first drink or drug, that falls by half. And if they can make it to 18, it falls in half again. So from 50 down to around 25, down to around 11 or 12%. And then the other thing is I almost didn't put a college chapter in the book because I'm like, well, why would I bother? College and alcohol go hand in hand, right? Absolutely not true. Only 60% of kids in college, roughly 60%, admit that they drink at all. And there are colleges that have, and I'm not talking about religiously affiliated colleges. There are colleges that have very low rates of alcohol consumption. In fact, historically, Black colleges have very, very low rates of alcohol consumption. And if you are in certain, whether it's ethnic, socioeconomic, there are certain groups that they just drink a heck of a lot less in college. And surprise, surprise, it's, white boys between, the ages of 18 and 24 who have a financial safety net, aren't on scholarship, aren't first generation. Those are the kids that drink the most. And that can depend based on a whole bunch, and who are in frats and who are involved in sports. So there are so many reasons that it makes so much sense to start young. And a big one is like I said, the younger kid is when they start, the higher their lifelong risk. And the easier those conversations become, like the sex conversation. It's not just one conversation, it's lots of them. And the more often we have difficult conversations, whether it's around sex or pornography or alcohol or whatever, the more natural those conversations become as part of just our family conversation, well of conversations. And in fact, in our house, it's such a normal part of conversation that no one flinches when we start talking about, okay, so you're in your second year of college now. What's happening with weed? What's happening with alcohol? Blah, 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 blah. It's not uncomfortable at all. It's just what we talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you're saying about it's not one conversation. We have the
oh my gosh,
birds and the bees, right? Is the talk. And it's like, because you've been talking about body autonomy since they were under 2 years old. And so it's been a lifelong of things that may lead up to the actual, that one discussion, but you've also expressed a way that there's a comfortability because we're not, that nothing is taboo.
Right. Well, and it goes right along with the conversations of, how to speak up for yourself when you don't like when someone treats you a certain way, and that's all stuff I talk about in Gift to Failure, which is also really valuable for, self-advocacy and making sure that no one touches you in a way that makes you uncomfortable, or, all of these conversations can't happen just once. They have to be ongoing conversations about, and negotiations. We could be treating our own kids in a way that makes them, I don't want you touching my hair like that. It really makes me uncomfortable. That's really important for us to be able to hear and be able to talk about, because that extrapolates out to someone maybe when they're 15 and in the backseat of a car and realizing they don't want to be touched the way they're being touched. And that's all really important.
That has been such a big thing in our household. I know a lot of people talking about like not forcing somebody to give somebody a hug, saying I'm not interested in that right now. Because, growing up, we were told like, go give that person a hug, go do this thing. And it's like, no, your body is yours to do. And even at 2, you can say no, thank you.
And all of this comes back around to you got to name it to tame it, right? Helping kids manage their emotions, helping kids speak up about their emotions. And I always have Tina Payne Bryson in my head talking about naming it to tame it, because, she's my name it to tame it gal. And all of this stuff comes back to substance use prevention. And because so much of trauma, adverse childhood experiences, that kind of stuff, the best interventions we have are helping kids manage their emotions so that they don't have to shove them down and quote unquote self-medicate them with something that helps them numb out. All of this teaching kids to speak up for themselves and know what their emotions are and talk about their emotions. And I'm so excited about their kids. Like there's a kid who Zach Gottlieb, who is a high school kid, and he has an Instagram account called Talk with Zach. And it's about kids talking about their mental health and talking about depression and talking about anxiety. And I love the fact that we have these kids who are saying, I don't think it's right that boys are told they're not supposed to feel emotions, or I don't think it's right that I'm not supposed to tell anyone that this is that I'm so much is being expected to me and of me, and I'm about to crack. They have to be able to talk about that stuff. And all of that starts as a similar conversation way back in preschool and kindergarten about what keeps us safe, what keeps us healthy, what keeps us happy, what keeps us fulfilled, that kind of thing. And whether that's about, the chemicals we put in our body or the way we let those emotions out, it's all sort of part of the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. And it is so helpful to be able to express that. And we'll go again, our common friend Tina, to name it, be able to say out loud,
Yeah.
and to not have to be vulnerable and to not feel the shame in expressing that we're not robots and can't do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore having to find these ways to numb out and to escape from the pressures and all of that. And what are some things that as caregivers we might be able to do to feel set up for success in helping that?
It's a lot, and it depends on the age. So that's, one of the things I learned from writing Gift of Failure is that parents want scripts, which I underestimated how much people would want examples of exactly what to say so that you can at least riff off of the examples. So that's why the addiction inoculation starts really young and gives scripts all the way through, like to your college age kids, and conversation starters and all that kind of stuff. But it can look a lot of ways. Like obviously you have the little kid, you're not talking to them about, crystal methamphetamine, but you are talking to them about, the toothpaste thing or the prescription medicine thing. And then when when they're a little bit older, maybe you're at Thanksgiving and their uncle has to go outside to vape or smoke because grandma doesn't let them smoke in the house. And you have a conversation about maybe, why do you think that grandma doesn't let him smoke or vape in the house? Is it just about it being smelly, or is it because something else? And then having that conversation, and if secondhand smoke is bad for us, then what is it doing to Ted? And why does he do that if it's bad for him? And sometimes people do things that are bad for them because of X, Y, and Z. And as they get older and they're seeing things in the media, we can start capitalizing on adolescents' natural aversion to being manipulated. So we would have lots of conversations in our house about, what is it that they're trying to sell you in this ad? Like, yeah, the ad is for beer, but it appears to also be about, you can be, super skinny and popular and on a beach and at a bonfire and have lots of friends if you just drink this brand of beer. And kids hate, and then you get to the conversations when they get a little bit older about, and I talk about this in the book, about how much brand loyalty, like let's say, there's a reason that when you go and watch like a soccer game, that the beer signs are in the places they are. For like, the reason they pay so much for at a football game the 50-yard line as opposed to somewhere else is because that has the highest visibility, and it's worth millions of dollars to a company to get brand loyalty really, really young. So if you drink X beer because it was the beer that was advertised on your favorite football team's, in their stadium, that's worth a lot of money. And so those beer companies, they don't want what's best for you. They want your money. And so when we're being told how to be by companies, let's develop some critical, back again to the critical thinking. Let's develop some critical thinking about, what is it people want us to do with the information that we're being given?
Yes. Critical thinking always comes back to, and that's a common thread of a lot of conversations I have on this show, for sure. I can't thank you enough for this discussion. I feel like I could keep you here for another hour at least, but
I feel bad because when I talk about this stuff, it's a lot of big picture stuff. And, to get on the granular level and say, well, here's exactly what you do when your kid is 6, I hope I've sort of given people the big picture. And then the cool thing is, if you're not a big reader, number one, the book, all my stuff is in audio. But a while back, someone suggested to me that if the substance use prevention stuff is a little scary for them, they may not come to one of my school events or my community events. because it scares them a little, or maybe they're not ready to deal with their own stuff, but they still
Sure.
want to know how to protect their kid. I did a daily video. I did a daily video series on my Instagram reels. And there's 170 videos and they're all 90 seconds long. And I literally made my way through the entire book. And I'm currently at the beginning of The Gift of Failure. And I'm going to make my way through that entire book. So if you go to @teacher_Lahey on Instagram, or I think I'm @Jess_Lahey on TikTok. They're all there. And you can just do it in 90-second increments in the privacy of your own home.
That's a generous thing that you've done, because people really do consume information differently. And I think in this conversation, people will be motivated either to get it that way, or certainly to get the book on audio or paperback. Or
it's a giant pain in the butt to put out a daily video, but I will tell you that some people have said to me, I just don't want to learn about this publicly, or I don't have time to read the book. And so, it's such important information. I don't care how it gets out. If it's getting out, that's what matters to me.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for the time you've given.
You're so
All of your
welcome.
contact will also be in the show notes here. So everyone who's listening, just go run down and click on that. And absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time and sharing
Thank you.
everything with us. It's been such a delight. And for everyone out there, be curious, not judgmental. Goodbye.